So Steve, since the Council of Nicaea, the church has affirmed that God is one in essence, three in persons, and that's probably what we could say everybody agrees on. Since that time, however, you've had some differences, and maybe it's safe to call it a split, maybe that's a little too strong, doesn't matter, but you've had at least two dominant perspectives on the Trinity that have emerged since Nicaea. What are those two perspectives, and what do they say?
Well, theology never develops in a vacuum. It always develops in both our context as well as in our controversies. And this is the case with the doctrine of the Trinity, both in terms of leading up to the Council of Nicaea and following it. So following the Council of Nicaea, you have, in the Christian church, you have two different contexts. You have a Western context, primarily speaking and using Latin as language and thinking in a Latin way. And then in the East, you have the church speaking primarily Greek and some other, even Semitic languages, and sometimes thinking in a different way.
And by East, you mean what will become Eastern Orthodoxy?
Eastern Orthodoxy, the eastern part of the church, Constantinople, the original birthplace of the churches that are in Revelation, for example, in that part of the world. These developments take place also within controversies. So in the West, the controversies that ensue primarily are challenges to the unity of God. There are challenges to thinking of God as one, as opposed to thinking of Him as three. So what happens in the West then, there becomes an emphasis on the unity of the Godhead, as opposed to the East, where there's an emphasis on the Trinity, the diversity in the Godhead, or on the persons. So if you think about Western Christianity, the emphasis is primarily on God being one. If you look in the Western church, or the Eastern church rather, the focus is primarily on God being three persons who are one essence. So what happens in the East is that the church is having to address challenges to its faith, what we believe about God, that are splitting these persons up into individual gods, whereas in the West the focus is on the unity.
Okay, so in the West more emphasis on the unity, and in the East more emphasis on the persons. Increasingly, evangelicals, though they're coming mostly out of a Western tradition, have wanted to go Eastern in their doctrine of the Trinity, in that they want to emphasize more the particular persons. So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Are we betraying our Western roots by doing that? What should we think about that?
Right. So again, theology developing in context. The context in which even Western evangelicals are doing theology now is different than 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And what I believe is happening among evangelicals is we're recognizing the virtue that is found in the distinct roles that the persons of the Trinity play. What's happened is, even though we've confessed a Trinitarianism in the West, we've fallen over into what's essentially a modalism or a Unitarianism, unintentionally. We still confess one thing, but we practice something else. So our praying is rarely Trinitarian, for example. Our worship is rarely Trinitarian. Even in many of our churches, we don't have an invocation any longer, which would have been an invoking of the Spirit to come and to be present, because we've jumbled the persons together. So I think what's happened is that Christians have naturally seen this and have tried to respond, and they found in some of the Eastern theologians, like in Athanasius, for example, a real emphasis on the triunity of God, and have found that there is great virtue in discovering the individual roles that the Father plays as the maker of heaven and earth, that the Son plays as the image of the invisible God, the incarnation of God, the recreator, the one who not only was the means by which the Father created all things, but becomes the means by which He recreates those who trust in Him and believe in Him. And then the Spirit as the one who brings to effect the work of God in the lives of individuals and in churches.
So interesting. You mentioned a very real way that this doctrine and the loss of an emphasis impacts the way we do church and exercise our spiritual life, praying. So how should Christians, how should we in the West, in the evangelical world, recover the proper kind of emphasis on the persons in prayer? What does that look like? How should we be praying in our churches?
So the way that Christians have described it in the past is that we pray to the Father, through the Son, and in the Spirit. And our language should reflect that, right? We should be praying to the Father. He is the one in Trinitarian theology who is the object of our praying. But we pray through the Son, or by means of the Son. Just as God, the Father, worked through the Son to bring about our redemption, we also then pray through Him to speak to the Father, and we do this in the Spirit. In other words, as men and women, believers who are filled with the Spirit and who have given ourselves over to Him and are led by Him, He guides our praying. He guides the way not only that we live, but the way that we pray as well. And the language that we use should reflect that we're praying in the Spirit, through the Son, to the Father, ultimately. And the same thing's true with our description of what we believe then. When we're telling people what it means to be Christian, we have to recognize that the Jesus that we're calling people to trust in is not simply anybody's Jesus. He's a particular Jesus who is the Son who is incarnate. And so when we turn to the Father to pray for the forgiveness of sins, to pray for our ultimate conversion, it's the Father who is saving us by means of His Son in the Spirit. And so we give ourselves over in our language, whether it's praying or even in evangelizing, to a genuine and robust Trinitarianism.